Welcome to segment 3 of Snow's Chess Academy Lessons on Chess. Today we're going to learn about castling, pawn promotion, and en passant captures. You'll recall in our earlier lesson we learned about how the pieces move in capture. Today we're going to focus on a rule that was created around 1100 AD called castling. You see, it had become way too easy to attack a king in the center. The king is very vulnerable from its start square on e8 for black and on e1 for white. And it was realized that should we leave our king in the center for very long, the king would not last very long, and the games were ending rather quickly. So they decided to invent a new way to protect the king, and that way was called castling. The two pieces involved in castling are the king and rook, and only the king and rook. You may castle on the queen side, or you may castle on the king side under certain circumstances, and we're going to show you those circumstances right now. In this position, focusing on the black pieces, the black king can castle on the queen side because there are no restrictions, there are no pieces in the way. Right now, though, the king cannot castle on the king side because the bishop is in the way. Were the bishop to move out of the way, black would be able to castle on either side of the board. Now, the thing to remember about castling is that only the king and rook can do it, and you cannot undo it, and you only do it once per game. We castle for two reasons: to make our king safe and to get our rook into the game. So when we castle on the king side, or castling short, as some people call it, we move the king 2 squares. You may recall the king is only allowed to move 1 square, but in castling he may move 2, and we put our rook on the other side. Were we to castle on the queen side, we would do the same thing, moving the king 2 squares and putting the rook on the other side. You'll notice there's a significant difference between castling on the queen side and castling on the king side, or castling long and castling short, and that the rook is far better developed when you castle queen side, and the king is not quite as safe. Whereas when we castle on the king side, the rook is not as well developed, but the king is a little bit safer. Now, many would say, how in the world is a king safer moving it towards the corner and castling? It is safer because there are fewer avenues to attack, and it is much easier to pile up pieces in front of a castled king and really build yourself a good fortress. Now let's talk about when you are not allowed to castle. We covered this earlier, one circumstance, when there was a piece in the way. So if there are any pieces in the way, you may not castle, whether they are your pieces or perhaps even your opponent's piece. No, you may not castle when your opponent's pieces are in the way either, and in this position, for the time being, black may not castle. All right. Now, you may also not castle if castling would put your king into check. Take a look at this bishop sitting here on c5. This bishop is controlling g1. Were the king to castle on the king side, it would be an illegal move because the king would be under attack. The game would not end here. Black would simply call out illegal move, and white would not be allowed to make this move. You are not allowed to put your king ever on a square where it can be attacked. It's one thing if your opponent moves and attacks you. That's what we call check, and we'll cover that in the next lesson. But it's quite different to move into check. No, you're not allowed to do that at all. Furthermore, you may not castle through a check. Let's take a look at a couple of more moves here. Let's take a look at this rook here on d8. It is now controlling d1. Should the white king choose to castle on the queen side, it would be passing through a check from the black rook, which would make it an illegal move. So no, we may not castle through a check. Finally, we may not castle when our king is in check. How unfortunate that is. That's exactly when you'd like to castle. For example, were this bishop to move to b4 and check the king here, the king would love to get out of check, but it cannot do so. What we might do first is block the attack, and when the bishop moves away, were to move perhaps back to e7, then we could castle on the king side and have the king be much safer. So, you may not castle into check, through a check, or when you are in check. You may not castle when there are pieces in between the king and the rook. And lastly, you may not castle if you have moved the king once already, even if you have moved it back to the start square. Furthermore, you may not castle on, in this case, the king side because the rook has moved. Even if it moves back to its start square afterwards, if it is moved, you may not castle. Now, In this position, this rook may have moved, but if this king and rook have not moved, it is perfectly legal for the king to castle this way. Notice the king was not castling through check this time because the rook's control of d1 is blocked by the knight, so we may complete our castling. So, we may not castle if the king has moved. We may not castle on the side of the board if the rook has moved. Now, what if the rook must pass through a square that is controlled by an opponent's piece? Well, the thing to remember here is that the king's the thing. It really does not matter if the rook is under attack. You may still castle. It does not matter if the rook is under attack, as long as the other conditions are being met. Or let's say if the knight was controlling a square that the rook will pass over, that does not matter. Black may still castle. It's only if the king must pass through check or into check. We generally castle somewhere between move 5 and 12 in the chess game in order to help the rook get in the game and for the king to be safer. Remember, we castle because we want to, we castle because we have to, but we don't simply castle just because we can. All right. Let's move on now to pawn promotion. Should a pawn be fortunate enough to promote itself to the other side, that pawn can become another piece. In fact, it can become any piece except for a king and a pawn. Why can it not become a pawn? Well, why would you want to become a pawn? You've sweated your way across the other side of the board. The last thing you want to do is remain as you were. And it can't become a king because, let's face it, there's only room for one king on the board. About 95–98% of the time, the promoted piece becomes a queen. But what if you already have a queen? Can you get two queens? Absolutely you can. Do not see pawn promotion as getting a piece back. No, that's not what you're doing. You're simply getting another piece, whether you have that piece on the board or not. You can get 2, 3, or 4 queens in chess. All right. Now, a pawn should not attempt to be promoted early in the game, rarely in the middle game, but most frequently in the end game. The end game is when you have about half or fewer of your pieces on the board and the king can become a fighting piece. So, should a pawn be fortunate enough to fight its way all the way down to the board and promote to the other side, it can become another piece, again, usually a queen, and it becomes that piece on what we call the promotion square. Okay? Nobody owns the pieces off the board, by the way, so after you promote your pawn, you may take the other pawn and put it anywhere you want to off the board. And now we're going to cover en passant captures. Around 1300, the French decided they wanted chess to be much more like real life. It seemed very unrealistic for one soldier to simply run past another soldier without, as the young people like to say, having them verse each other. No, it seemed unrealistic at all. One pawn shouldn't be allowed to run past another pawn and simply wave goodbye. No, it seemed inappropriate. So, the en passant capture was invented. Should a pawn move 2 squares forward and be next to an opposing pawn, the opposing pawn may, on the next move and the next move only, if it is on the 5th rank for white or on the 4th rank for a black pawn, it may capture that pawn as if it had only moved 1 square, not 2. This is called an en passant capture. En passant is in passing in the French language, and so this pawn is able to capture the black pawn as it was attempting to pass it. Okay? Now, again, for black, should black have a pawn on the 4th rank, and should a white pawn attempt to run past it by going 2 squares and only 2 squares, the black pawn on the next move and only on the next move may capture that pawn using an en passant capture. Why does the pawn only get one chance to make a capture en passant after the pawn has moved forward? Well, the idea is that this pawn is attempting to run past it. Okay? So, you only get one chance to shoot someone who's running as rapidly as they can past you. Now, what if this pawn were on the 3rd rank and the red pawn moved 2 squares forward? Could we capture en passant then? No. You may only capture en passant if you have a black pawn somewhere on the 4th rank. Okay? What if the pawn had moved 1 square forward when you had a pawn on the 4th rank? If it has moved 1 square forward, you may not capture en passant. It must move 2 squares forward. All right, so The thing to remember for white is that it must have a pawn on the 5th rank to make an en passant capture. For black, it must have to have a pawn on the 4th rank and only on the 4th rank to make a capture. If a pawn moves 2 squares forward next to that pawn, and this pawn got here first, you may capture en passant. If this pawn, the black pawn was on the 4th rank first, you may capture en passant. En passant captures don't happen very often in chess, and so it's an easy rule to forget. That's why it's a good idea to look it up on a regular basis when you're going to play chess, just so you can be reminded of it. Thanks so much.